My name is Norman A. Sidley, and my birthday is May 7th, 1936, which makes me a little bit over 79 years old today. Today is,
July 30th,
is it July 30th?
2015.
2015.
Hey! You vicious thing. Okay, Dad. Why don't you just talk a little about where you were born and your early memories?
Well, I was born, I don't remember where I was born. I don't remember anything about being born, but I know that the place was in St. Paul, Minnesota on Randolph Street. And my parents lived in the upper floor of a duplex, but not for long. I moved out of there when I was an infant because my father bought a home in St. Paul at 572 Laurel Avenue. And it was a 3-story home, and we lived on the ground floor with my father's mother, my Bobby, and on the second floor lived a family, I can't remember their names, maybe Bronsky or some Johnson or something, don't remember, nice people but never saw them. And on the third floor lived my Aunt Goldie and my Uncle Archie and my cousins Joe and Edith Gilbert. And in the back of the house there were 2 garages and a little backyard. And I remember that in one of the garages that we used, my cousin Sissy had a bike. It was a black bike, it was nice, and had little white wall tires. And she used to let me ride it, although I couldn't really ride, but she didn't mind if I used it. That house had a front room, which was kind of like a porch, but it was enclosed. And then behind that was the living room. And then behind that was the dining room. And behind that was the kitchen. And behind that was a pantry. And there was a stairwell in the back by the pantry. And there was a stairway in the front. And I used to go up the stairwell in the back to my Aunt Goldie's house, because my Aunt Goldie was a wonderful baker. And she would make what she called semmelach, which was cinnamon rolls. And when I smelled those, I'd go upstairs and she would give me a cinnamon roll. I was very small, I probably crawled up the stairs. And my Uncle Archie, he didn't smoke cigars, but he chewed them. And he sometimes he lit them, and sometimes he would put it in my mouth. He'd say, "Here, take it." So I would be puffing on a cigar and eating a cinnamon roll. It was quite nice. My Bubby lived with us. Her name was Leah.
Stop, Dad. Okay, so I think you were going to tell us about your grandparents. Your grandma.
My grandma, my Bobby, whose name was Leah, maiden name Leah Bekovitsky. She was married to my grandfather, who passed away before I was born. His name was Nathan Sidletsky, and I'm named after him, and so is my cousin Ted and my cousin Nate. Our Hebrew names are all Natan. My Bobby lived with us. She was very learned in Judaism. And frequently the rabbi would come over to our house and consult her about some matter. Apparently her father was a well-known rabbi, and she was always in the room when he was teaching.
Where?
Someplace in Poland, I think, although I'm not sure. She didn't speak any English. She spoke only Yiddish. And so in my house, when I was a little boy, we only spoke Yiddish. Unless she wasn't around, then we spoke English. I wish that I remembered more Yiddish, but I remember enough to carry on a conversation as if it's about the 3rd grade level. She was an Orthodox Jewish woman, and because of that, we kept kosher in the house, and we observed all the holidays, and we did all the things that you're supposed to do if you're an Orthodox Jew. So when it was coming time for Passover, we'd go through the house and get all the chametz out, and she'd go around with a feather and sweep out the corners, and then we'd put it all together, we'd burn the chametz, and then we'd change plates, and we changed pots and pans. And I think after a while, she became rather senile. And she just sat around, kind of did nothing. So my dad moved her to the Jewish Home for the Aged, which we call the Shalom Home. And she was there, and then we visit her now and then she passed away. My mother's parents lived on Grand Avenue in St. Paul, and they were not quite as Orthodox, but they were still Orthodox. And it was Morris Puzin and Esther Puzin. And the story I heard about why his name was Puzin was that he originally was named Barzel. His father was named Barzel, which means iron. And he was going to be conscripted, my grandfather was going to be conscripted into the Russian army. And in order to avoid that, my great-grandfather made a deal with the French family to say that he was their son, and their name was Puzin, so he adopted the name. I don't know if that story is true or not, but it's a story that I heard and I remembered.
Your Uncle Barney said that they got the name Puzin off a gravestone.
Could be. It could be. I'm not sure of what stories to believe. But in any case, my great-grandfather, my grandfather's father, was still alive when I was born, and I remember him. He had a long white beard, and he always wore a kind of a square yarmulke. And I remember that I liked him, but I didn't like him when he would always put me on his chest and put his beard over me, and it itched. And I didn't care much for that. But he lived with his daughter, my grandpa's sister, who was my great aunt, Bubla, and her husband, whose name was, we called him Boris. I don't know what his name was, Boris maybe. And they had 3 children, 3 boys.
Was Bubba her real name?
Bertha was her name.
Oh yeah, Bertha Konevsky.
Yeah, the Konevskys, Bertha Konevsky. And they had 3 sons, Izzy, Isidore, Mike, and Stanley. And they were in the produce business. They had a store downtown St. Paul on Jackson Street, and they sold lettuce and tomatoes and things like that. And they always kept some produce in their garage at home, up in the top of the garage. And we used to kid her because she would say things like, "Throw me down from the garage. I had lettuce." Just throw me down. She lived until 104, and even when she was over 100, she worked at the State Fair in Minnesota, which is only 2 blocks away from the Shalom residence where she lived. She would go to the State Fair every day and sell knishes in a little stand, which was quite nice. I remember they told her when she was maybe 80 years old, shouldn't have salt. Salt in your diet is bad for you. She never ate salt. So maybe that had something to do with her living at 104, because she outlived all of her. Well, she lived longer than her children lived. Well, her children, of course, she died before they did, but they never reached her age, not even close. Anyway, I digress. My grandfather, Morris Puzin, was and is probably the most important man in my life. He was, well, I can remember one other, but he was the only man in my life who I felt had respect for me. He liked me. He played with me. He showed me tricks. He was kind of an amateur magician. He taught me tricks, and he played cards. He let me play cards with him, and he had an amazing memory. I remember I could open up a prayer book, any page, and read a line, and he'd go on from there. And of course, they're quite redundant, but still, he could do that. And once, I think it might have been at his funeral, and the rabbi said he was the only man who could pray faster than he could. He had a Chevrolet with at that time it was a vacuum shift. It was interesting, and he would put me on his lap and let me drive, steer the car. He was I remember once my sister and we got a rabbit. It was a white rabbit, and my mother said we can't keep the rabbit because it's a rodent and it will attract other rodents and mice and rats. We have to get rid of the rabbit. So my grandpa came, picked us up. My grandpa and grandma came, picked us up, and took us, my sister and I, in the back seat of the car, and we put the rabbit by the window ledge in the back, and we drove out into the country to what that time seemed like a long way out in the country, which today would be nothing, to Chaska, and we let the rabbit out in a field. And then we drove away, and my sister were looking out the back of the window and crying for a rabbit. And my grandpa had a friend that grew sugar beets in Chaska, and so we went into Chaska, and they had a store, and he bought us ice cream cones. I remember having an ice cream cone driving back.
What was Morris's wife's name?
Esther.
Oh, that's right.
My grandma's name was Esther, and she had 3 children. The oldest was my mother, and next was my Uncle Herman, and then my Uncle Bernard, Barney. And they lived in a little town in North Dakota, Powers Lake, North Dakota, when the kids were young. And my grandfather and his friend from Europe, who had come over together, they opened a general store, or they bought the general store, I don't know, but they owned the general store, which in that town was called the Jew store. I think there was only one Jewish family in the town, it was them. And everybody would come and trade at the store, and he told some stories about the store, which I'll relate. But there were no other Jewish families, and so when my kids got to be the age of about a bar mitzvah, they decided to move into the Twin Cities. My grandfather was elected the mayor of Powers Lake, North Dakota, which was pretty unusual. And I've looked up some records of Powers Lake, and I find that he started a lodge there, a Mason's lodge. The story goes that a man that they called the Empire Builder, James J. Hill, built the railroads across the northern part of the United States. And his financier was a man named Adolf Bremer. And Bremer would open up a bank in every town. As the railroad progressed, they'd come to the town, and Bremer would open a bank. And one time, Bremer came out on the railroad, and he stopped in Powers Lake, and he went to the bank, and he said, "Who's the biggest depositor here?" And it turned out to be my grandfather. And so he said he wanted to meet him. And he met my grandfather, spent some time with him. He said, "You're wasting your time here. You should come to the Twin Cities, and we can do some good business together." I don't know if that's a true story or not, but it's a memory. So my grandfather went to St. Paul to work with Bremer, and Bremer introduced him to another fellow whose name was McKnight, and they had a business making sandpaper in St. Paul, and then they needed a bigger place because they were doing very well. And apparently my grandfather thought that they had made some deal with somebody on the city council to condemn some land so that they could buy it cheap. And so he decided that he didn't want to be associated with people like that. So he got out of that business. Today that business is called 3M. So I asked my grandfather, "Do you ever regret doing that?" And he said, "No, I always have had plenty." From there he went on to become an executive for a company called Minnesota Envelope, Kaplan Paper Box. George Kaplan was the guy that owned that, and he hired my grandfather, or my grandfather was a consultant, I'm not sure. And my grandfather would work out ways that they could cut boxes and use the minimum amount of waste. And as fate may have it, many years later, I was working for a cousin of mine, and we were buying some boxes from that company. And I asked the guy, "How do you make these boxes? How do you?" So he said, "Well, we have a sheet of formulas that we use to do it." I said, "Where did the sheet come from?" He says, "Some man named Pouzin was." He was a very smart guy. Another story was that when he was in Russia, there was a contest in the paper. And I used to remember what the contest was. It was about raising money for charity, and somebody would give so much if this other thing was so much, and it was this. And it was a complicated thing to work out. He worked it out, and he got some kind of a prize for it. He was very sharp guy. My grandmother, Esther, was a terrific cook. I didn't know this about her, but my Uncle Barney later told me she couldn't spell, that she was a terrible speller. And I remember she had false teeth. I only saw her without her teeth once when we slept. My sister and I slept over at their apartment, and she came out. She looked completely different without her teeth. But she had a kitchen that was probably 8 by 8. And it had a gas stove, and it had an ice box, not a refrigerator, and an ice box, and there was a panel in the wall of the kitchen. It was a door, and the iceman would come down the hall, and he could open the panel and put the ice in there, and then she'd put it in the refrigerator. And she could cook. She made pies and cakes and chickens and strudel, and she was a terrific baker and a terrific cook. All in this little space, hardly any workspace. And today you'd think there's nobody could do that. She made knishes that were terrific. The dough was spread very, very thin out on a table where you could read a newspaper through it. And then she'd fill it with potato, some kind of potato mixture that she made, and then roll it up and then make it a big like a big coiled snake. And we cut it up and eat it with ketchup. My Uncle Barney ate everything with ketchup. And she used to have that sometimes that there would be people that would come in town that she knew or somebody knew. They weren't relatives, but they were friends of the family, and landsmen, they called them. These were people who lived in the same area that they lived when they were in Europe, and when they came over, then they got together.
Do you know where they were from in Europe? I mean, where they were from in Russia?
No, I don't. She was from Poland. I don't know where.
Your grandma was?
Yeah, my grandmother was from Poland. And I don't know where they were from Russia, but I'm sure wherever it was, it's changed. You know, that I'm sure the city's the same, but whether it's now Poland or some other country, I don't know. But they came over because my grandfather came over first. He was a young boy. Maybe he was 18 years old or something. He came over, And he established roots in Minnesota, the Twin Cities, and then he went over and he brought over his father, and then they brought over the family came over Yidel by Yidel.
Mm-hmm.
A Yid is a Jew. And then they all got over here, and some of the friends did too. There were some famous people in that group. The names won't mean anything to you nowadays, but you could look them up. Maybe Google. The one I remember is Norman Katkov, Katkov. He was an author. He was a screenwriter. My grandfather used to play with my father. Used to play pinochle. It was my father and my grandfather and Boris Kanevsky, and they would play. It's a three-handed game, and they'd play. And I think my father was the worst player, and my grandfather was the best player. And they'd play all the time. And my father would smoke cigars all the time, and Kanevsky smoked cigarettes. Kanevsky died of lung cancer. When sometimes Kanevsky wasn't available, and my grandfather would invite me to play, and my father hated that.
Why?
I don't play with him. He doesn't know anything, and put me down. And but I was okay. It didn't matter, but to my grandfather, he'd teach me. You know, if I didn't know, he'd tell me.
And I thought the grandmother on the other side was a really good cook too. Leah?
My Bubba. Yeah, my Bubby. We called my father's mother Bubby and my mother's mother Grandma. And Bubby was a good cook too. I remember she and my mother and my Aunt Seal making blintzes in an assembly line. You know, one would make what's called the fine cooking, the very thin egg, and then you pass it off to the next one, and the next one fill it with, put the cheese on, and the next one would roll it up.
Did you have holidays
Huh?
Did you have all the family have holidays together?
No, we had big holiday dinners, but they were either the Pouzin side of the family or the Sidley side of the family. And even of the Sidley side, there were too many of them. So my grandmother, my Bubby had, I think 8 children, I'm not sure. She was Ida and Fanny and Goldie and Seal and Sophie and John and Abe and some more that died along the way.
Oh.
But anyway, the family was too big, so and everybody got married and everybody had children. So Fanny always had a big party, and we had a big party, and Seal or Ida had a party, and there wasn't enough places for everybody.
Okay. So, sorry, we were talking about holidays.
On the holidays, we always had a big meal. And so every now and then we'd go over to one of the aunts' houses, and my Aunt Fanny was a good cook too, and she would make more food than anybody could eat. As a matter of fact, the joke in the family was that when we were all done eating, Fanny would remember, oh, I got another dish I put in the downstairs, and she always made more food than anybody could possibly eat. So we would say, in this family, only too much is enough. We had Thanksgiving. We would celebrate the Jewish holidays the night before Rosh Hashanah and the night after Yom Kippur. Other festivals, there was Hanukkah we would celebrate. I was made to attend Hebrew school and Sunday school. On Sundays I'd go to the Temple of Aaron Sunday School. And I don't know if I learned anything there or not. I can't remember anything about it except we used to sing a song when we got there. God is in his holy temple. Something like that. Hebrew school, every day after regular school, I get picked up by a bus and driven down to the center, Jewish Community Center, where the Hebrew school classes were held. And my friends and I would go to class. I never paid much attention, although I learned Hebrew somehow. And that went on until I was in high school. I had a bar mitzvah, and then everybody says you quit after that. It's done. But they wouldn't let me quit. I kept going through high school. And where the center was right across the alley from the Temple of Aaron, which was a conservative temple that our family belonged to. My bubby belonged to a different temple, an Orthodox temple. My grandma and grandpa belonged to the Temple of Aaron. It was a rough time in the Twin Cities at that time. Rough for the Jews. A famous anti-Semite named Father Coughlin had a radio program, and we were picked on a lot. I was chased home from school several times, and people threw rocks at me. My Hebrew school teacher was a short man named Mr. Gordon, and they once beat him up, and it was a terrible time to be Jewish there. And I used to come home when I was a little boy and cry and say, "Ma, why do we have to be Jewish?" And because we are. But that's pretty well gone from here now, I think. But it left a stain, left a mark. We couldn't go. There were certain neighborhoods where we couldn't buy houses, and there were certain restaurants you couldn't go to, and hotels you couldn't stay at, and it was difficult to be a Jew. So as a result, we had our own country clubs and hospitals and other places, social clubs, so on. It was like separate but equal. They used to say the neighborhood was restricted, and what they meant was no Jews and no blacks. Foolish, but that's the way it was. As a result of that, during all my formative years, I still have a great affinity for Jewish people and a great suspicion of people who aren't Jews. I don't trust them. It's like I think they could turn me into the Nazis. It doesn't go away. I don't know why, but it doesn't. It's probably irrational. The school that I went to, the grade school, is called Webster School, and it was on one side of a playground, and then across the playground was the high school, which was Marshall High School, and across the street from Marshall High School was the Jewish Community Center and the Temple of Aaron. So everything was in this maybe 2-block area there. And on one side of the playgrounds, I had a couple of aunts living on one side and a couple on the other side, and we lived on the end. And so I think within a 10-minute walk you could get to most of our family. And that was nice because if somebody wasn't home, you go, "Can I stay over there?" And my 2 cousins, Helene and Joni, I could go over to their house, they could come over to my house. Are you going to answer?
Okay. Well, why don't you tell me about your parents?
My parents were Min and Abe Sidley. Min's last name was Puzin, and my dad's last name was Sidletsky, but he changed it to Sidley when his brother did. His brother John did. My dad had a company called Sidley Hosiery Company, and he sold hosiery and gloves and mittens, wholesale, and he spent a lot of time on the road. He would drive from St. Paul to out as far as western Montana, and then turn around and come back. And it usually took about 3 weeks for his trip, and he'd call on stores on the way out and on the way back and sell whatever he could sell. He started the business with a man named Mo Wiseman, who was a brother-in-law of his. Mo was Seal Wiseman's husband. And Mo had cancer and died very shortly after the business was started. And he left Seal with 2 small children, Helene and Joni. And my dad asked Seal if she wanted to take Mo's place in the business, and she did. So she came in and was a partner with my dad. And a little while later, a few years later, my Uncle John left his job at Cardozo's, which was a furniture store, and he came in with my dad too. So the 3 of them were partners in Sidley Hosiery Company. My dad had an oldest sister, Ida, and Ida had 3 children, Marilyn and Shirley and Charlie. And Ida's husband, who was also named Charlie, he had died, and so my dad kind of became a surrogate father to those 3 kids. And then he became a surrogate father for Helene and Joni. And by the time I was born, I think he was pretty well fathered out.
But weren't Helene and Joni born after you?
No, they were older than I am.
Both of them?
Both of them.
Oh.
Helene only 6 months, but...
Oh. And is Shirley still alive?
Nope.
Oh,
I have very few cousins alive, although I had many, many cousins. But the cousins I have alive are Helene and Milty and Ted and Nate and Raleigh and Diane and Natalie, as far as I know. And I think that's all I have. Not very many, considering there were a whole bunch of us at one time.
Yeah, but there must be some Konevskis alive, aren't there?
No. Konevskis are all gone.
They are?
Yep.
Wow. Huh.
Yeah, and all of my parents' generation, they're all gone. All my dad's brothers and sisters and all my mother's brothers are gone.
Is Lil still alive?
Nope.
No, she died.
No, there's none of that generation of my family left on either side. Barney had a daughter and a son, and the son died. Steve died, and the daughter Barbara is still alive. She lives in San Antonio, and she was taking care of her dad when her dad died down there.
And how about the High's kids are alive, right?
High had a boy and a girl. Steve. Not Steve. Michael and Carol. Carol had cancer and she died.
Oh.
Michael's still alive and he's married to Sharon. Michael was a dentist, Sharon was an ophthalmologist, and they're both retired. They live in Baltimore. They pronounce their name Puzin.
They do?
Yes. Dr. Puzin.
How funny.
I think maybe they think it sounds more sophisticated. I'm not sure. I think their mother, High's first wife,
Selma?
Selma, said Puzin.
Oh.
Uh, and I don't know why they stick with it, but when I'm there, I can say Poozin. So we'll see. Barney all said Poozin.
Yeah.
Barney was a great uncle. I loved him very much. He would come over when he was in the Air Force, and I'd try on his hat, and we would put lather on my face and shave, and we had a good time. I loved my Uncle Barney.
What was his first wife's name?
Teddy. Theodora.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Oh, wow.
That was the mother of his 2 children.
Huh.
And his second wife was from Sweden, and her name was Britta.
I remember her.
And his third wife was Eleanor.
But Britta wasn't Jewish, was she?
Britta wasn't.
Yeah.
Neither was Theodora.
She wasn't?
No.
Wasn't that a big deal?
If it was a big deal, I wasn't aware of it.
Oh.
Because they lived away from us.
Uh-huh.
Barney was in the Air Force, and he traveled all the time. For a long time, he was stationed in Wiesbaden, Germany, and so we never. The only time I saw him was when he came in town for like Pesach or some other time. But I really loved my Uncle Barney. I would go. One time we flew on my airplane. I picked him up in Austin, and we flew to we flew to Santa Fe, New Mexico, to see his son Steve. And then from there we flew to Boulder, Colorado to see Pete was in college. And then I flew back to Minneapolis, and he took a commercial flight back home. He died last year. And he left me some money. And Barbara told me that I was the only person other than her mentioned in the will, which was, unexpected, but very nice. I don't think he had contact with anybody else in the family. I mean, all the people who could have contacted him, they didn't. Maybe Bernie Bernstein did at one time, but Bernie died too.
And you don't think he was in contact with Michael?
No, I don't think he was.
Or Marla. Or
Marla at all. The only time he was in contact with Michael was at High's funeral. I told Barney he said he was too ill to come up, but I said, no, you come up and I'll pick you up at the airport and I'll take care of you. And they did, Barney and Eleanor, and we took care of him and took him back.
Did they go on your boat?
Barney never went on the boat. High went on the boat before I bought it.
Oh, that's right.
He climbed up on the boat, and all he had to say was, "This is a big boat." No, Barney, the only people in my I think Elaine and Bernie were on the boat.
Oh.
But nobody else from the family that I remember was on the boat. On Carol's side,
Mark was on the boat.
Mark
Malia
was on it. Nephew Glenn was on. Well, that's a whole other story. I went to Webster Grade School, and then I went to St. Paul Central High School. And when I graduated there, I went to the University of Minnesota, and I was a terrible student in the sense that I didn't go to class. I bought the books, but I never went to class, and I hardly ever opened the books. And for the first year, it wasn't too bad. I got by. In the first course, I got A's, and then I got B's, and then I got C's. And by the second year, I was getting F's and D's, and they asked me to leave. So I did. And then, after a while, after I was out for a while, I realized that I'd better get a college education. Excuse me. So I went to the Jewish Family Service, and they had a social worker who went to the university and pleaded my case, and they let me back in on probation, and I studied. I did very well after that. During the time I was at the University of Minnesota, I met Barbara Crane, And she and I had a romance, and we got married, I think it was the same week that we graduated. And then we went immediately to work at a summer camp, Herzl Camp in Wisconsin. She was in charge of arts and crafts, and I was the waterfront director. And we lived with a couple who were the
Horns?
the Horns, Bill and Dina Horn. He was a rabbi. And we shared a house with two sides. They were from New York. Toward the end of our time at summer camp, I decided that, or we had decided that we'd go to New York for a honeymoon, New York City. And I thought, well, as long as we're going to New York City, I'll apply for college that's in New York. And I looked around, and the college that I recognized was Columbia University. So I wrote an application to them and sent them, I think it was $10. And we finished camp, and we drove, and we had a new car which my folks had given us for a wedding present. And we drove the car out to New York City and checked into a hotel. I think it was the Palmer Hotel or something like that. It was the only hotel that I remembered because my father and mother used to stay there. And I said, well, let's call up and see what's happening at Columbia University. So I called and I talked to the admissions people, and they said, yeah, you're admitted. And I said, great, when does school start? And she said, Thursday. And I said, which Thursday? She said, next Thursday, day after tomorrow. And we had no plans. I mean, all we had is a suitcase with our clothing in it. And so I called the Horns, who were living in New Jersey, and told them the story. I said, can we live with you for a while? And so we went, lived with them for a few weeks, and Bill he was like the visiting rabbi for a little congregation in Ridgefield Park, New Jersey. And one of the congregants was moving out or leaving her house. She was getting divorced. And so he prevailed on her to let us stay in her house when she was gone. So we stayed in her house and painted it inside. And it was okay for a little while. And then we found an apartment, a garden apartment in Englewood Cliffs. Or maybe it was Englewood, New Jersey. Anyway, it was a nice place. It was right across the street from where the Lindberghs had lived, and down the block from the park where the Lindbergh baby was kidnapped. And that was very nice. We commuted. I would drive the car in over the George Washington Bridge and park by school, or else I'd take the bus or the bus and the subway. And it was a commute to get to school. And I had long hours. I stayed. They let me teach a class. I taught statistics there, and it was at night. It was like 7 to 10 or something like that. So I would always get home pretty late. And that was fun. I was there for 3 years, I think, to get my doctorate. And I was kind of a bad boy because my folks came out for my graduation. And it was kind of raining, and I said, I'm not going to go because it's going to be held inside and it's going to be hot. And so I didn't go, and they didn't go. And maybe 2 months later, I went to the bursar's office because I was still at Columbia. And I said, I'd like to get my diplomas. She said, well, which diploma is it? A master's degree and a doctorate. And she gave me the 2 diplomas. That was the end of my Columbia education. And my dad was in town he went to some meeting where they were buying hosiery and stuff like that. And he introduced me as Dr. Sidley. It's my son, Dr. Sidley. And I said, but I'm not a real doctor. Marla and Merle came out and announced that they had gotten married. Nobody knew.
Oh, your mom and dad didn't know?
No. A little later on, a few months later, they had a wedding in Minneapolis.
Mm.
And the only thing I can remember about that wedding is my dad said, he came up to me and he said, I'm not feeling well, I have pains in my chest. And I said, well, let's go get you some medicine. So I drove him to the drugstore to try and get a nitroglycerin pill for him. The pharmacist wouldn't do it. And he was in real pain. But he recovered from that when he went back to the wedding, but it was scary.
Hmm.
My mother was a good cook and very mother hen like. I mean, she was always, you call that, tell me where you are and don't be late and this, and she was always checking on me with my friends and stuff. And I resented that. And I don't have very good memories of my mother, positive or negative.
Do you think she went to college?
Both my mother and father went to college, but they didn't graduate.
Neither.
Neither of them graduated. But they both went.
Did they not graduate because they got married in the middle?
No, I think they didn't graduate because they didn't think it was necessary, and they needed to. They started working. My dad started business, and it wasn't common among their peers. And,
Uh-huh.
They were each other's best friends. They had a good time together. They would lie on the couch like spoons and watch baseball games.
Oh, wow. Did you ever go on vacation?
We went on vacations, the ones that I can remember. We went to Yellowstone Park once. And we went to New York once. And that's all the ones I can remember. I remember when we went to New York, I was young, I was maybe 14 years old, and I loved the subways. I loved riding the subways. I would go down, I'd stand in the first car and ride from one end to the other. It was great.
Did they read?
They read. My mother was a reader. My father wasn't so much a reader.
You told me once they had friends over to play cards.
Yeah, they had good friends over. Their friends were the Greenbergs, Dr. Greenberg and his wife. I forgot her name, but he was the dentist, and my dad's dentist. And they would come over and play cards. They played gin rummy, or I think it was gin rummy or something. I don't think they played bridge. And there were some other couples that came over. They had a good time. They had my mother was kind of social. She was at Hadassah and other things like that. So they had a group of friends that were friendly with my dad and mother, and also my Aunt Seal and some of my other aunts. And they were all about the same age and the same group.
What else do you remember about your aunts?
My aunts...
Did they all get along?
They all got along, but their husbands didn't get along.
Oh.
My uncle, my aunt Sophie, was married to a man named Sam Pogler, and my Uncle John was married to a woman named Lil Halper. And my Uncle Sam thought that I'm not sure how this started. Maybe it was my Uncle John thought that my Uncle Sam had eyes on Lil.
Oh.
So they didn't speak. Also, it turned out that my Uncle Archie, who lived upstairs on the third floor, did something criminal. I don't know what it was, but he wound up in prison. And then when he came out from prison, because they didn't tell us that, when he came out from prison, all the kids were lined up and saying, "Welcome, Uncle Archie. Hello, Uncle Archie." When he came home, but nobody knew where he was coming from. But the story that they told me was that he had been in Alaska. He was helping build the Alcan Highway.
Oh, wow. How long do you think he was gone?
I have no idea. When I was really little. That was one of the scandals in the family. The other one was that John had gotten married and then gotten divorced. He was the only one in the family that got divorced.
Oh,
so Lil was
really?
his second wife.
Oh.
Nobody ever said anything about that. Until years later, Marilyn made a tell-all tape.
Oh.
And she told the story. I never listened to the tape, but I know she told that story.
Oh, I listened to some of that tape.
Yeah. And also, years later, Diane, Garrett's made a tape too. She went around and interviewed the family, and I never listened to that too, but I bought it for her.
Do you still have it?
Maybe.
Will you look?
Yeah. I have no idea where it would be.
Do you remember you had done some other scandal on that tape?
That was on that tape, and that was the only one I know of. Marilyn. Hi, guys. Marilyn was a pretty smart cookie, and she went to Chicago and had a program on a radio program in Chicago. And Charlie, her brother, went to Hollywood, and he was an actor. He was in one of Elia Kazan's films with, I can't remember the name of it, but who was the guy with Opie?
Ron Howard?
No, not Ron Howard, but the sheriff. The actor who played the sheriff.
Andy Griffith.
Andy Griffith. It was Andy Griffith's big introductory picture.
Did he play a cop?
No, he played a guy, a singer, who did better and better and better in the audience. And Charlie was in that. Then Charlie went to New York and started producing television.
Oh.
And he produced, I think it was called As the World Turns or something. It was the longest running soap opera ever. And I remember going to visit him in his place in New York, and his wife's name was Holly. Hollis something, who was an actress, and she played Blondie on the television series. She played Blondie's wife's friend on the television program. But Charlie and Holly lived in New York in an apartment on Sutton Place, and we went up there, and it was all this beautiful wooden panel and big dining room, and we were at the dining room table with Crystal and a little bell.
Oh, wow.
The maid came in, the cook came in. Very fancy.
Shirley told me a story once about when the family came to the United States that they worked as seamstresses at the Golden Needle.
Golden Rule.
Golden Rule.
Yeah, my aunties were good seamstresses. Her mother was a good seamstress, and Fanny was a good seamstress, and they did that when they came first to the country. But Ida kept doing it. She was doing it when I was grown. They were piecework, you know.
At home?
No, they were.
Oh, they went
went to a factory every day. Huh. It was across the street from my dad's store, and she rode in with them, and she rode home with them.
Your dad had a store?
My dad had a store, yeah, Sidley Hosiery Company.
Huh? I thought it was just traveling.
No, he had a store too.
Where was that?
325 First Avenue North, Minneapolis.
Oh. How long do you think he had that for?
Oh, a long time. He owned the building. 20 years maybe.
Huh.
Long time.
Did he travel while he had that?
Yeah. John and Seal were there. And neither one of them traveled. Seal's accounts were in Twin Cities. And John was the bookkeeper. The accountant, the controller, whatever.
And then did they sell it and all retire, or do you remember what happened?
Yeah, they sold it and they all retired. They sold the building and they sold the business. to a guy who didn't know anything about the business, and he went out of business, but they sold the building, and the building then became a nightclub. It's funny, I remember in that building, Milty and I used to work there sometimes. And the building had an elevator, old elevator with a rope. You'd pull it up with a rope,
Oh, wow.
and then you'd let it go and it'd come back down. And it was really hard to do, but it was fun. And it had, the second story was rather high, so it has, I think it had a long flight of stairs and a little balcony, then another long flight of stairs. And my dad would go up and down those stairs all the time. And his sister Seal would yell at him, "Hey, don't do that, you're doing too much." And so my dad would take me to work if he could wake me up. Sometimes I wouldn't get up and he'd get very angry. But when I did get up, I'd drive with him to work. And he'd tell me what he wanted me to do, and I'd do it. And then we'd go out for lunch, or sometimes I'd go out for lunch by myself. But when we went out to lunch together, it was always just across the alley to a little luncheonette, and he would have a bowl of sour cream and cottage cheese and chopped up vegetables, radishes and carrots and tomatoes, and 3 or 4 pieces of rye bread or pumpernickel. I'd branch out a little. Sometimes I'd have a ham sandwich or a hot dog or something, bowl of soup.
So they didn't care if you ate unkosher food outside of the house?
No.
Would they eat
As a
it?
matter of fact, when I was young, I was really, really thin. And the doctor, who was Jewish, Dr. Rosenthal, Robert Rosenthal, told my mother, said, you know, if you can arrange it, maybe take some pumpernickel bread and cut it up into little squares and fry it in bacon. And so we had on the second house, after Laurel, we moved to a small street, it was 1 block long, called Roy Street, 698 South Roy. And that was it was a kind of a rambler, but it had an attic. And so up in the attic, we always had a frying pan and a spatula.
Oh.
That was for the bacon.
Oh, how funny.
So when my mother would go upstairs and bring it down and cake the bacon, go back upstairs. I hated it. I loved bacon, but I didn't like the
Fried bread.
fried bread and bacon. I didn't care for that. Anyway, as you can see, I didn't stay skinny forever.
What do you remember about your first jobs?
My first job was, I worked as a carry-out boy in a grocery store that was part of a chain. It was called Klein's, and there were 3 or 4 of them.
Harry Klein's?
Yeah. Harry Klein and his brothers owned the stores.
In St. Paul?
Grocery stores in St. Paul, although then they eventually opened one in Minneapolis. But in St. Paul, and I worked on the Grand Avenue store. And I was a good worker, doing stocking the shelves and so on. And some friends worked in the produce department. It was fun. And we, started out at maybe 47 cents an hour, and worked my way up. Big wages, maybe 72 cents an hour, something like that. And then they would send us. There was a crew of 2 or 3 of us, and they'd send us to the different stores at night to do price changes, because the way we were pricing was we had these sticks with prices on the bottom and a stamp pad and stamp purple on it. So when we would change the price, you had to go with a steel wool, take off the old one. That was a real pain. Harry Klein later on was the lover of Barb's Aunt Sue Crane, who was the widow of George Crane. George was the father of Mike. And in the summertime in St. Paul, it was quite hot and muggy. And so my grandfather, Morris Pouzin, liked to go out of the city And I thought it was way in the country. It was Forest Lake, which is about a 20-minute drive. And they rented a place, a home in a little resort on a lake. And there was a double home, or a duplex, and his sister and her husband, the Konevskis, would take part of it, and they'd take part of it. And one of the boys, Stanley, the youngest son, was there, and I would go frequently out there and spend a day in the water and fooling around. And it was quite nice to be out there. The interesting thing was that when the Konevskis and the Puzins were sitting around talking, they would speak Yiddish until they realized that I knew what they were talking about.
Oh.
And then they spoke Polish or German or Russian or some other language that they had. It was a lot of fun. Mike Konevsky was there too, and I remember that we used to go into town, and there was a little ice cream store, like a Bridgman's with counters and stools, and we'd sit down and we'd have ice cream sundaes or sodas or something. And the big song at that time, which we'd play on the jukebox all the time, was "Peg of my heart, I love you." Peg.
Oh, he married a peg.
And he married a peg, yeah, Peggy. I don't know what happened to Mike. Some of the family says, well, he had an accident, car ran into a bridge. Some of the rest of the family says, no, he committed suicide. So I don't know what the story is.
You don't know if Peggy's alive?
Peggy's probably alive. And they had a son, Jay, who I saw, he was a chef. Stanley would go, they had a place at a lake in Minnesota or Wisconsin. And then in later years they'd go down to Florida, where he had a place in Florida in the winter. And he had a heart problem down there, and he had a bypass operation in Florida, and a few weeks later he died from complications. And Izzy had a heart problem, and he died just a few years ago when Bernie Bernstein died. Bernie Bernstein, it's interesting, my grandpa, Puzin, had a brother. The brother had two girls. And the brother never came to this country. The brother was killed in a pogrom in Russia. And the girls apparently saw them cut his head off. So the girls, Edith and Anna, came to this country. And Anna got married
Without their mom?
without their mom. I don't know what happened to their mom. I never heard about that. But they came to this country, and Anna married a man named Bernstein, who was one of my grandmother's relatives. So she was my grandpa's relative and married my grandma's relative. So
Wow.
we were connected on both sides. And his name was Bernie Bernstein. He was a tailor. He had a little tailor shop on Selby and Snelling in St. Paul. And they had a son who they named Irwin, but everybody called Bernie. And Edith, the older sister, married a man named Kushner, but I forget his first name. They had a son named Alvin. And they lived in Camden, New Jersey. Another interesting one was that Marilyn Schatzberg, Ida's daughter, married a man named
Jules?
Jules Schatzberg. Her name was Marilyn Zipperman. And she married Jules Schatzberg, and so she was Marilyn Schatzberg. Jules Schatzberg had a stepbrother named Joe Schatzberg. And he had a son. He was married to it's very complicated. He was married to a woman whose sister was married to someone on my grandma's side of the family. So it's all
Intermingled.
somehow. And they lived in, the sister lived in New York. Her name was Ethel. And her husband's name was Abe, and her last name was Paul. Abe and Ethel Paul. And she was a super duper secretary. She could type 120 words a minute. She was terrific. A very heavy set woman, very jolly. And her husband was a very nice guy, very peaceful and calm. When Barb and I were in New York, we would see them every now and then. But in their building, they lived in a big building, and I can't remember where it was, but in the basement of the building, they had there was a mechanic who had a little machine shop there, and he'd work on cars. And I took my Chevy in there, and he made it like a new car. It was just wonderful. Al Hemme was his name.
Didn't you work in a brewery?
I worked in a brewery one summer. One summer we had a big storm, and it blew down a lot of trees. And the city hired just about anybody that could breathe to come and help clean up the mess in the city. And a guy with a truck would come, and he'd work, and then he'd use the truck to haul away the branches. In the meantime, there'd be a crew of 4 or 5 of us that he'd leave us out on the street. We'd cut the branches off and pile them up and then load them onto the truck and so on. And then they'd go away, dump them at the dump, and come back for the next one. And I was there with my buddies. I was there with Mel Burstein and Ronnie Schumeister and Burley Kaplan. Although I wasn't, they're all a couple of years older than I was. So when the work let up a little bit, they let me go because I was too young. I shouldn't have had a job in the first place. And then 2 or 3 of those guys, I think it was Ronnie and Mel, went to work in a brewery, Schmidt Brewery or Ham's Brewery, one of those. And I went there too. And I got a job, but I didn't last very long because they found out how old I was. But it was interesting that working at the brewery, out of every hour there was 10 minutes that was called schmear time. And you could go and drink whatever there was. And there was a guy there who had set up with hot dogs. So you'd go have a hot dog and drink beer, and some of those guys had huge bellies, the workers there. It was terrible work.
What did you do?
Well, there were different things to do, but one of the things was that the beer bottles would come by on the line, and behind the beer bottle was a very bright light. And you'd sit on the outside of the line, and you'd watch the beer bottle with backlit. And if it wasn't filled right, or if there was something like a cigar or a mouse in the bottle, you had to jam this metal plate in there and stop the line and throw the bottle out and let it go again. And it doesn't sound like a big deal, but looking at it was very tiring. One time, it was hard to get jobs and stuff, but one time Mel and I went and we got a job at Land O'Lakes Creamery. And our job was to move cases of butter, which are about 18 inches by 18 inches by 18 inches of cubes, move them from one cooler to another. And they weighed 100 pounds.
Oh, wow.
And that was almost more than I weighed. So I picked this up and take it home. And I said, I can't do this for a whole day. I said, there's got to be some benefit. I don't want to lose the benefits. I said, what's the benefit? Can you get any deal on the butter? And so the guys were, yeah, you can get 92 score butter for the price of 89 score butter, which was something to do with the butter fat. I said, I don't care. So I quit. I went to lunch and never came back. Then I got another job with my friend Burley Kaplan. We went down to the creamery, Crescent Creamery. They made ice cream and stuff. And they hired us. They had him washing the walls in the office, and they said, go up in the elevator and crush the bananas. So I went up in this elevator, and it was fairly dark up there, a big warehouse, and there was a big barrel, and there was big crates of bananas there. So I'd take a banana and I'd peel it and I'd throw it in. When I got enough, I'd push this thing down, crush them. And I did that for a while, and then I came downstairs, and the guy said, did you see any tarantulas? So I said, no. I said, there's a lot of tarantulas in those banana packs. I thought tarantulas were terrible. I mean, I've subsequently learned that there's not a big deal, but
Wow.
I got scared, so I quit. And Burley didn't like washing walls either, so he quit. So we'd spend the summer going from job to job trying to find something that was pleasant to do and that paid us. The best job was that cleaning up the trees. It paid very well, and it wasn't that hard.
The battery's going to die in a minute. But when do you think you started going to Herzl Camp?
Oh, I started as a camper. My family was always involved in Herzl Camp. Marilyn, I think, was the first director
Oh, wow.
of Herzl Camp, and Ted was the first waterfront director. And Joni and Helene went, and Milty went, and we were all we were all there. And I don't remember how old I was. I was probably just after my bar mitzvah or something. I went there as a camper, and then later on when I was in college. Maybe at my junior year, or maybe my sophomore year, I went to get a job for the summer, and the director at that time was Zvi Dershowitz, and he said, you don't have the qualifications to be the waterfront director, but if you want to come up and be the handyman, it's okay. So I went up for the summer and was a handyman. I'd pull hair out of the drains, and I'd empty the garbage and take it out to the dump and stuff like that. It was not a big deal. It was not a pleasant job, but it was okay. And the nice part about working at the camp was that when you got a check, which wasn't very much money, at least you had it all because you didn't do anything during the summer to spend it.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas if I could have made more money in the city, but I would have spent it all. Then I went, he said, well, if you get your WSI, Water Safety Instructor, certificate, I can make you the waterfront director. So I went to the Red Cross and I did all that, and I got a WSI. And the next year I came back, and the next year after that I came back as a WSI and was the waterfront director. And that was fun.
Was there an emphasis on Zionism?
It was a Zionist camp. Oh yeah, we would sing all the Zionist songs, and we knew what the Haganah was, we knew everything. That was we were big Zionists. I mean, if you didn't know what it was before you got there, you sure knew what it was afterwards.
Uh-huh.
And the state of Israel. And I remember when Israel became a state in 1948, and everybody got called. If you were Jewish, you got called, and you went down to the auditorium in St. Paul, and there was everybody did a horror, and there was big dancing and celebrating, and there was booths set up with food and things. It was really a happy time. I also remember I remember VE Day and VJ Day, and how everybody came out in the street and celebrated. I was dancing in the street, and it was really fun. But before that, during the war, we had ration books. You couldn't go to the store and get butter or meat or stuff like that if you didn't have a ration book, and you had certain stamps, and you could only get so much. And people say we saved string, we saved tinfoil, we saved all kinds of stuff, and we'd flatten out cans and for the war effort.
Well, did you have any relatives who were still there that your parents or grandparents were worried about?
They might have been, but I didn't know about it. If they were there, I didn't know about it. My Uncle Barney, of course, was in the Army at that time. The Air Force didn't exist. It was the Army Air Force, and then it broke off, became the Air Force. So they were worried about him.
Mm-hmm.
And they didn't know where he was, because you couldn't write and say where he was. So he wrote a letter, and he asked about Has Aunt Judy's bris been yet? There was no Aunt Judy, and there was no, so
Yeah.
my grandpa figures, oh, he's in Brisbane, Australia.
Really?
Yeah, and that's where he was.
Wow.
Uh, When later in the war, my cousin Chuck was in the army, and he was a scout in the Pacific, and I think he got malaria. I'm not sure, but they were always worried about him. She'd throw up. She was so worried about Chuck, and where is he? And he's fine. Why did he have to be a scout? Why does he have to go? You know. She was always worried about him, but the other people, let's see, Milt never went, Nate never went, Ted went, but he went in as a captain because he was a doctor.
How come people didn't go?
4F. Milty had flat feet or something, and
You didn't go because...
I didn't go because I had cut my hand.
Uh-huh.
I got drafted, and I got called down. I was living in New York at that time. I got called down to have my induction physical at Whitehall Street, and then they found this and they said, no, you can't go. But I don't remember anybody worrying about relatives that were there, although your mother had relatives that were there. Her mother, Dorothy's mother, that family was wiped out by the Nazis. They ran ahead of them. No, my families were over here running away from the pogroms in Russia. They got over here before the war. My dad was in the First World War, as he was drafted, and he went down, he got inducted, but he never went into the service because of something wrong with him too, a heart murmur or something, I don't know.
Huh. Do you have any idea what year he came to the United States?
What year he came? No, I don't know what time. It was the early 1900s.
Were all the sisters born in Russia?
Yep.
The whole family was born in Russia?
The whole family was born in Russia. And none of them knew when they were born either. None of them knew where their birthday was because there was always a birthday that was established by the Jewish calendar. So my father was born on the fourth night of Hanukkah.
Uh-huh.
I mean, you could probably figure out what the fourth night of Hanukkah was and
1898?
whatever year he was born, but nobody remembered. They just remember the fourth night of Hanukkah.
Huh.
So he just took arbitrarily, he took December 25th as his birthday.
Huh.
AC, so he didn't know what the C was for, and I didn't know what the A was for. So he said C is for Christ, so December 25th. So. And I don't know what the A was for. I used to tell people I have a brother Norman B. Let's see.
Did you get along with your sister growing up?
When we were little, we got along. We'd had the same bedroom, and we would have two twin beds, and one on either side, and we'd pull the covers over and we'd talk. We'd just play telephone. So we had a string and a cans. But as we grew older, we had less and less to do with each other. Until at this point, I talked to her twice a year.
Yeah, but
on my birthday and hers.
But when I was growing up, we used to see them almost every weekend.
Really?
We saw them all the time. That was your social life, them and the Burns.
The Burns, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I guess.
You don't remember?
We had, because we had children that were, we wanted you guys to know each other. Speaking of the Burns and children, Neil told me that Scott has been hired to write the next Star Wars film.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. What other things?
Did you spend a lot of time with your cousins when you were a kid?
Always spent time with my cousins.
More than your friends? More than friends?
Oh yeah. Especially Elaine and Joni and Milty and Ted, because, well, Milty, Ted no. because of the three parents worked together. So we'd go over, I'd love to go over to my Uncle John's house because he had a little workbench. I would pound a nail on 2 pieces of wood. I didn't make anything, I painted it. You know, it's just fun farting around. And he lived next door to my pediatrician,
Huh.
Robert Rosenthal. And he lived next door to the playground that was Linwood Grade School's playground, where Milty went. And in the kitty corner was a store that sold ice cream. And they sold these things called dumbbells. It was 2 balls of ice cream that had been dipped in chocolate with a stick between them. And if you ate, when you ate one of those, it could say free on it, you take the free stick and they'd give you another one. So we ate those all the time.
Do you remember the ration books during the war?
Oh yeah, I remember ration books. I remember Selby, the street Selby around Dale, which is, last time I was there, it was a very rough neighborhood, but when we lived there was a lot of Jewish people lived there, because it was only like 3 blocks away from the temple in the center. And there was a drugstore on one corner and a drugstore across the street from it. One was Snyder's, and the other was Snyder Brothers.
Mm-hmm.
And down the block a little ways was a butcher shop, Gantman's Butcher Shop. And across the street was Eisenberg's Butcher Shop. And next door was a dry goods store, also owned by a Jewish guy. It was a very nice Jewish neighborhood. And they used to send me to go get some this and get that. And there was a bakery there. It was a good bakery. And I remember getting into real trouble once because my folks gave me 50 cents to go to the bakery. And I came back from the bakery with a cake, a chocolate cake. They said, "You spent the whole 50 cents on a chocolate cake," but they were really angry with me because they expected me to spend a nickel and get a donut or something like that. I wasn't in their league, I guess, but I remember going downtown. It was somebody's bar mitzvah and I had to get dressed up, so I went downtown to buy a shirt. And I went to a store, it was called Maurice Rothschild's.
Downtown St. Paul?
Yeah. There's also one in Minneapolis, but this one was St. Paul. In Minneapolis it was Young Quinlan. But they carried shirts, this very nice line of shirts, Alfred shirts. And I bought this shirt, it was $8.50, and they went nuts. I could just spend $8.50 for a shirt.
Did they worry about money a lot?
Well, they behaved as though they worried about money, but they always had adequate money. I mean, we never wanted anything. There was always plenty of food. My dad always drove a new car every few years. My mother had some kind of fur coat. I don't know what it was. My dad was a very impulsive guy, though. He came home from work one day and told my mother that he sold the house. He sold the house we were living in because he got a good price for it, and then he went and they bought another house. They sold the one in Roy and they bought one in Fairview. It was actually a nicer house. It was a good move.